Dagestan's mountains stood like silent sentinels, watching over a boy forged in hardship. Khabib Nurmagomedov was not raised. He was constructed, piece by piece, under the watchful eye of a father who demanded nothing less than absolute dominance. Before he could spell his own name, he was wrestling bears, his small frame thrown into the cold grasp of survival. In a land where weakness meant failure, his childhood was stripped down to discipline and struggle. He ran through frozen rivers, trained on jagged hills, and learned to endure pain like it was air. There were no soft words, no comforting hands, only the relentless voice of his father pushing him beyond exhaustion. The other children played. Khabib prepared for war. His fists carved his destiny into the dirt. His sweat baptized him in suffering. The echoes of his ancestors rang in his ears, whispering of warriors before him. There was no luxury, no distractions, only the promise of victory or the certainty of failure. Each breath was a vow, each step a march toward the inevitable. The world did not know his name, but the mountains did. The boy who trained in silence would one day shake the earth with his roar. The cold air burned his lungs as he ran, his feet pounding against the unyielding ground of Dagestan's wilderness. There was no stopping, no turning back, only the brutal cycle of pain and progress. His father's voice rang in his ears, a constant reminder that greatness was not given, but taken. The hills swallowed his breath, the ice numbed his skin, but the fire inside him only grew. There were no celebrations, no words of praise, only harder training, deeper suffering, and the silent understanding that he was being prepared for something far greater than himself. Each throw against the mat, each hour spent locked in relentless combat, carved him into something monstrous, something unstoppable. His childhood friends faded into the ordinary, their paths diverging into normal lives, while Khabib's road led deeper into the abyss of discipline. Pain became his closest companion, fatigue his sworn enemy, and defeat a word he refused to acknowledge. The village watched in silence, sensing that the boy who ran in the mountains was no longer just a boy. He was a storm waiting to be unleashed, a force of nature destined to break anything that stood in his path. The echoes of combat filled the small gym, each thud of bone against mat a violent symphony of discipline. Khabib's body moved on instinct, reacting before thought, striking before doubt. He was no longer just training, he was sculpting himself into an unbreakable machine. The pain in his muscles was ignored, the exhaustion in his bones disregarded. His father stood at the edge of the mat, his face unreadable, his judgment absolute. A mistake was met with harsher drills, a moment of hesitation punished with another round of relentless sparring. There was no comfort, no room for weakness. His training partners, once eager to test themselves against him, now hesitated before stepping forward, knowing that inside that cage there was no mercy. Each takedown was a statement, each submission a reminder that he was evolving into something terrifying. The walls of Dagestan could no longer contain him. The time was approaching, the moment when his name would be spoken not in whispers, but in fear. The world of combat had no idea that a predator was being prepared in the shadows, a fighter who would not just win, but dominate. The walls of his homeland could no longer hold the beast that had been forged in its depths. The time had come to leave the mountains, to step into the world beyond, to test himself against warriors who had never known the brutality of Dagestan. His father's final words before his departure were not of pride nor sentiment. They were commands, unshaken, absolute. Go, show them. Khabib did not question, did not hesitate. The journey to the unknown was not a step, but a march, a soldier moving toward war. The flight to America was long, but his mind never wavered. While others slept, he saw visions of battle, his fists colliding with flesh, his grip closing like a vice, the sound of bodies breaking beneath his will. This was not a dream. This was prophecy. When the plane landed, the air smelled different. The streets hummed with a rhythm he did not recognize. It did not matter. He had not come to adapt. He had come to take over. The cage was waiting, and inside it, men who thought they knew what fighting was. They had trained in luxury, in comfort. They had never run on frozen hills or fought beasts in the dirt. They had no idea what was about to be unleashed upon them. The doors of the American gym swung open, and eyes turned to the newcomer. He was silent, his expression unreadable, his presence heavy with something they couldn't define. Fighters sized him up, their curiosity laced with quiet amusement. Another foreign wrestler, another man chasing dreams in the land of warriors. But Khabib did not see them as equals. He saw them as prey. The first sparring session began, and within moments the amusement died. The mat became his hunting ground, and his grip was something unnatural. Iron forged in the mountains, pressure that felt inhuman. One by one, training partners fell, struggling for breath, trapped beneath a force they couldn't understand. Coaches whispered among themselves, watching a man who did not stop, who did not tire, who did not break. He wasn't learning their ways, he was imposing his own. This was not just training. This was an invasion. He was proving a point with every takedown, every ragdoll throw. The message was clear. The world had been fighting the wrong way. The real fight had just arrived, and his name was Khabib Nurmagomedov. The gym had seen champions, killers, men who prided themselves on their toughness. But they had never seen this. Khabib did not train, he devoured. Each round was a storm, suffocating, relentless, a pressure so absolute that even black belts and knockout artists looked helpless beneath him. His sparring partners came in waves, fresh and ready, but all left broken, gasping for air, their bodies betraying them. It wasn't just the strength, the technique, or the endurance. It was the way he never stopped. There was no rest, no hesitation, no moment to breathe. He did not fight like them. He fought like something ancient, something raw, something terrifying. The walls of the gym felt smaller when he was inside, the air heavier, the energy darker. No one wanted to admit it, but they all knew. This was not a man playing by the same rules. He was built differently. He was conditioned differently. He had no interest in being liked, in being admired. He was there for one reason, to dominate. And soon the world would be forced to understand what it meant to be trapped beneath the eagle. The whispers had started. Coaches, fighters, analysts, everyone in the fight world had begun to sense it. Something different was coming. It wasn't just another rising prospect, another name to be thrown into the fire. It was something inevitable, something terrifying. The way he moved, the way he controlled, the way he suffocated his opponents, it wasn't normal. The gym had become a proving ground, and Khabib had turned it into his own personal battlefield. There was no such thing as a fair exchange, no moment where his opponents could reset. He did not allow space, did not allow air. The second his hands touched you, the fight was over. He wasn't just winning, he was breaking people. Veterans left sparring sessions shaking their heads. Young fighters avoided eye contact. It was like being dragged into quicksand, deeper and deeper, until the only thing left was panic and regret. The UFC had no idea what was about to enter its cage. A machine had been built in the mountains, and it had been designed to destroy. The doors of the UFC swung open, and Khabib stepped through, not as a newcomer, but as a storm on the horizon. The roster was filled with killers, men who had bled for their place, warriors who had torn through competition to stand at the top, but they had never faced something like this. The first fight came, and within seconds the truth was revealed. He did not trade punches, did not play a game of inches. He walked forward, untouched, unstoppable, and dragged his opponent into the abyss. The moment they hit the mat, it was no longer a fight. It was a sentence. The crowd watched in confusion, then shock, then silence. The man beneath him struggled, twisted, fought for survival. But there was no survival, only suffocation, only domination. The referee pulled Khabib off. The fight over, the opponent shattered. Analysts scrambled for words, but deep inside, they all knew. This wasn't just another fighter. This was a system, a force, a nightmare wrapped in flesh. And it had only just begun. The octagon had held legends, champions, men who had built their legacies with blood and will. But now it had become something else, a prison. The moment Khabib stepped inside, the atmosphere changed. The energy shifted. His opponents weren't just fighting, they were entering survival mode before the first punch was thrown. The bell rang, and he closed the distance like a shadow, suffocating, unstoppable. They swung, they kicked, they tried to escape, but there was no escape. The instant his hands gripped their bodies, the fight was over. The cage became their grave, and Khabib was the executioner. He didn't win rounds. He erased hope. Commentators were stunned. Fighters watching from the locker rooms felt a creeping dread. This wasn't a man competing for victory. This was something greater, colder, more absolute. His ground and pound wasn't just punishment, it was a message. The division had been warned. The lightweight throne had an unrelenting force marching toward it, and when he arrived, no man would be left standing. The division had tried to ignore him, dismiss him as just another wrestler, another grinder who would fade when the real wars began. But war had always been his home, and now there was no denying it. Khabib Nurmagomedov was not here to compete. He was here to conquer. Fight after fight, he walked through men who had spent their lives mastering violence, making them look like amateurs, like helpless victims caught in the jaws of something unstoppable. It wasn't just the victories, it was the way they happened. No damage taken, no struggle, no doubt. He was rewriting the sport in real time, proving that skill alone was not enough, that toughness alone was not enough. Fighters who had spent years crafting their striking, their knockouts, their power, none of it mattered when they were dragged to the ground and drowned under a pressure they had never experienced. The belt was still held by others, but in the hearts of those watching, they knew the truth. The real king was coming. The reign of terror was about to begin. The belt had always been a symbol of greatness, a prize that only the toughest, the smartest, the deadliest could claim. But Khabib didn't see it as a prize. He saw it as a formality. His name was already etched into the division's history, his path one of absolute destruction. The top contenders were lined up, but they weren't standing in his way. They were standing in his wake. Each step closer to the title felt inevitable, like the script of war had already been written. The UFC tried to sell the drama, to hype the matchups as battles of skill, of strategy. But when the cage door closed, reality hit like a sledgehammer. There was no strategy against him, no blueprint to escape, no way to prepare for the kind of pressure that crushed wills and shattered dreams. One by one, contenders fell, their confidence ripped away the moment his hands locked around them. It was no longer a question of if he would be champion, it was a question of when. And when that moment arrived, it wouldn't be a victory, it would be a reckoning. The world had seen champions before, men who had fought their way through fire, clawed their way to the top, but no one had ever marched to the title the way Khabib did. It wasn't a rise, it was an inevitable conquest. The day had come, the lights burned bright, the arena shook with anticipation. Across from him stood the final obstacle, the man wearing the gold, a champion by title. But Khabib didn't see a king, he saw prey. The cage door locked, the crowd roared, the bell rang, and in that instant, the illusion of competition was shattered. He closed the distance like a force of nature, unshaken, untouchable. The champion swung, desperate, hopeful, but Khabib didn't flinch. The moment his hands found flesh, it was over. The takedown was not a move, it was a death sentence. The ground became his domain. The champion's will began to crack. Punches rained down like hammer strikes. Pressure suffocated, time slowed. And then came the moment. The tap, the surrender, the end of the old era. The referee pulled Khabib away, but the truth was clear. The throne had been claimed. A new ruler had arrived. The belt sat heavy on his shoulder, but Khabib barely acknowledged it. To him, this was not the destination. It was simply the next step. The division had a new king, but this was not a coronation. This was the beginning of an era of dominance. Champions before him had defended their titles with skill, with heart, with strategy. But Khabib defended his with absolute control. There was no back and forth, no wars of attrition, only suffocation, only destruction. The contenders came, each one certain they had the answer, each one convinced they had the tools to solve the puzzle. But once the cage door locked, once his hands found their mark, the truth became undeniable. There was no answer. There was no escape. They trained for fights. He trained for annihilation. The world watched in awe. in disbelief, in fear. They had seen dominant champions before, but none like this. None who walked through the fire untouched, who left no room for doubt, who shattered legends without a scratch. Khabib had not just taken the throne, he had rewritten what it meant to be a champion. They came like wolves, hungry, desperate, believing they could be the one to end the reign. Each challenger had studied the tapes, obsessed over strategies, convinced themselves that they had found the flaw, the weakness, the gap in his armor. But there was no gap. There was no weakness. The moment they stepped inside the cage, they were no longer challengers. They were victims. Khabib fought with a cold, calculating precision, like a man who had already seen the outcome. He was not reacting. He was enforcing. The second he closed the distance, the fight became a slow, agonizing realization that they were trapped in something beyond their understanding. They weren't just losing, they were drowning. Their energy faded, their hope disappeared, their will shattered. The maulers, the knockout artists, the submission specialists, it didn't matter. They all broke the same way. Commentators ran out of words. Fighters who had once scoffed now watched in silence. The division had no king, it had a tyrant. And with every passing fight, the message became clearer. This was not an era. This was an empire. And empires do not fall. The world had tried to resist, tried to believe that somewhere, somehow, a man existed who could stop the storm. But storms do not stop. They consume. Fight after fight, Khabib did not just defend his title. He erased the belief that anyone else could ever hold it. His challengers were not stepping into battles. They were stepping into executions. The hype, the game plans, the bold predictions. They all collapsed the moment the fight began. The fear was real now, etched in the eyes of every contender. They had seen the footage, felt the pressure, known deep down that what awaited them was not just another opponent. It was inevitability. His grip on the division was not just strong, it was absolute. His name was whispered in gyms like folklore. His presence loomed over every fighter daring to climb the ranks. Some champions inspired hope. Khabib inspired doubt, despair, and surrender. Because this was no longer a question of competition. This was dominance in its purest, most terrifying form. There comes a point when dominance is no longer measured in victories. It is measured in fear. Khabib had won every fight, but more than that, he had taken something from every man who had dared to stand across from him: their confidence, their spirit, their belief in themselves. They walked in as warriors, but they left as broken echoes of who they once were. His opponents didn't just lose, they never recovered. And now, with the world watching, the numbers told a story no man could deny. Unbeaten, untouched, untamed. The greatest wrestlers had been smashed, the hardest punchers had been drowned, the slickest technicians had been made to look like amateurs. Analysts scrambled for explanations. Fighters searched for hope, but there was none. What they had witnessed was not just a champion, it was something beyond the sport itself. A force, a storm, a leviathan that had risen from the mountains, devoured everything in its path, and left behind a legacy too perfect to be matched. There is a moment in every legend's journey when the war is no longer about proving greatness, it is about securing immortality. Khabib had walked through every challenge, shattered every expectation, and rewritten the definition of dominance. But there was one thing left, one final battle, not against an opponent, but against time itself. He stood at the peak, untouchable, unmatched, undefeated. The world begged for one last war, one final test to see if he could be beaten. But the truth was clear. There was no test left. There was no challenge. He had conquered the sport, ruled the division, and left no question unanswered. And so, as warriors continued to rise, hoping to carve their names into history, Khabib made the choice only the greatest can make. He walked away, undefeated, undisputed, unchallenged. The belt, the division, the sport itself, it would all move on. But his legacy? That would never fade. Some fighters win titles, some build legacies, but only a few become myths. Great warriors do not fear battle, they fear what comes after. The silence, the stillness, the absence of war. Khabib had lived his life as a storm, tearing through everything in his path, leaving behind only dominance and destruction. But now, with the world at his feet, he faced the one fight he could not train for, the decision to leave. The belt was his. The division was his. The sport itself had been bent to his will. Yet without his father, the man who had built him, shaped him, prepared him for war, victory no longer felt the same. He had promised, a vow made not to the sport, not to the fans, but to the man who had given him everything. One last fight. Then walk away. The moment arrived, the cage door locked. The world held its breath. And once again, it was not a fight. It was a reckoning. He dominated. He suffocated. He broke his opponent's will as easily as he had done before. And when the tap came, when the referee stepped in, when the silence fell over the world, it was over. Not just the fight, the war. The cage door swung open. But this time, Khabib didn't rush through it as a challenger, nor did he walk out as a reigning champion. He stepped away as something more. The gloves lay on the canvas, the belt rested on his shoulder, but neither defined him anymore. His mission was complete. His promise had been kept. No one had taken his throne. He had left it on his own terms. Unbeaten, unmatched, untouchable. The crowd roared, the world watched, and the fighters in the back stood frozen, knowing they had just witnessed something that would never be repeated. Some retired to escape defeat. Khabib retired because he had conquered everything. The fight game moved on, new names rose, new champions were crowned, but none could escape his shadow. The numbers spoke, the footage remained, and the truth echoed forever. He was the one fighter who left the battlefield with no scars, no doubts, and no losses. A warrior who had turned into a legend that had turned into a myth. And myths, they never die. Time moves forward, eras fade, champions rise and fall, but some names are written in a way that time itself cannot erase. Khabib Nurmagomedov was never just a fighter. He was a force, a storm that passed through the sport, leaving behind nothing but dominance, respect, and an untouchable legacy. Fighters studied him, but there was nothing to replicate. His mindset, his discipline, his relentless will. These were things that could not be taught. Some believed his departure left a void, but the truth, it left a warning to every warrior who dared dream of ruling the division. His shadow still loomed over the sport, his name still whispered in the corners of every gym, his style still feared in the minds of those who had felt it. The record remained unbroken, the legend remained untouched, because true dominance is not measured in wins and belts. It is measured in the silence that follows when the greatest one leaves, knowing no one will ever take their place. The eagle had risen, the eagle had left, but the eagle would never be forgotten.